Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the What's New in Prisma live stream that my colleague Ryan and I are hosting every 2 weeks here on YouTube to talk about the latest news in the Prisma ecosystem and in the Prisma community. Hey Ryan, how are you doing today? And what's the weather like in Canada?
I am doing well. The weather is cold. It is cold and snowy, as you might expect, but I think it's looking up. I'm looking at the forecast, and we've got some better temperatures coming. So I'm hopeful for that. The winter is dragging here with the pandemic, with not being able to go anywhere. It is not a winter as it typically is, and it is starting to be a drag on everyone. So some nice weather will be welcome.
All right. Over here in Berlin, things have changed quite a bit compared to last week. Last week, we had a lot of snow and ice, and the last 2 or 3 days, temperatures were rising and rising. And it seems like over the weekend, we'll even have temperatures around like 15 or 16 degrees, which means that basically within a week, we had a difference of temperature of like 20, 25 degrees, which sounds insane. But the warm weather is definitely also welcome over here.
Absolutely.
All right. On the stream today, I think we have a couple of really cool things to talk about. So as usual, of course, we'll talk about this week's release and give you an overview of what is new. And then we have 2 guests this time. So first, we'll talk to our VP of Product, Hervé, who's joining us from France, actually. And we'll talk about the official Prisma roadmap. And he'll explain a little bit how it works, what kind of stuff is on there, how it's being structured, and all of that. And of course, you can put your questions in the chat if you have any. So just drop them in the YouTube chat and we'll pick them up from there. And then the second guest that we have is Jed Watson. He's the creator of KeystoneJS, which is a sort of CMS that he's going to show us how you can use it. And it's also, you can use it together with Prisma. So we'll also talk a little bit about that and how these two fit together. Ryan, to kick things off, do you maybe want to share your screen and walk folks through the release notes, and we can talk a little bit about the things that are new in this release 2.17?
Let's do it. You can see this?
Yes, looks beautiful.
All right, so here we are at the latest release. This is on our GitHub, of course, Prisma, and you can go to the releases. This is 2.17, and we've got a bunch of fixes, a bunch of improvements in this release, and we will step through them. I've got nothing to demo today. We're going to just kind of talk about what's new. We'll maybe riff on that between Niko and I a little bit. And if people have questions, feel free to ask, and we'll do our best to address them. A couple big things to pull out. One would be native types being stable. So if you recall, if you've been around with us for a while, native types are this kind of newish thing since 2.10, where you can do db dot, and I'll expand this so you can see stuff like this, db.boolean or db.tinyint. You can set, instead of using like a string, you can just do varchar at 200. You can specify the length. You can have these native database types. It started out by, you could introspect your database to get those types annotating your model, but now you can put them into your model and inform your database through Prisma Migrate as to the shape it should take. So we are stable here. This is great. It's GA, and this helps us along the way to be sort of fully GA everywhere.
Very cool. I really like, by the way, how this is implemented in Prisma in terms of that, you don't need these kind of native types annotations if you don't want them, because by default, we will pick an appropriate database type for you if you just want to kind of model your schema in a more intuitive way, and you don't really care about the specific underlying column type that's being used on your tables. But if you have these specific requirements for, say, constraining the length of a string, then you can add these additional attributes to your Prisma fields, and they will be mapped to the underlying column type accordingly. So having this kind of default mapping that already works for the majority of cases, but then being able to kind of adjust things when it's needed is really a pattern that we're trying also to like put into Prisma in like various places also.
Yep. Yeah, the flexibility is key. People like that. And a common question that I'll touch on here is like, when you do put something like a string, kind of like a scalar like this, what does it actually turn out to be in the database that you're using? We've got this doc. I'll open it here. I assume this is the right one. It's a doc called, you know what? Let me do this because I kind of lost my spot. Where did we go? We were down over here somewhere.
Further up, yeah.
I had to expand this type mapping reference in the docs. We have this doc which shows you what, like if you use a string, what you will get on the other side. So for example, here in Postgres, you would get text, and then you, like MySQL, varchar at 191, that sort of thing. So you can take a look at the docs to see what the default is. And this is a good opportunity for you to break away now from the defaults if this doesn't suit your needs. So native database types, very cool, very cool. It is now at GA. So that is that. Anything else to say on native DB types, Niko?
Not so much, I think. That was a good overall overview. It was certainly a feature that has been long awaited by the community and now is available. So very excited about this.
Absolutely. The next thing we'll talk about is something that is also very welcome, which is Prisma Migrate now working with cloud databases, cloud hosts, I should say. So if you use something like Heroku to host your database, or DigitalOcean or something like that, there was an issue previously where you wouldn't be able to run migrations on the cloud hosted database. And that is because of how Prisma Migrate uses a shadow database. So a shadow database is something that is created when you're doing your migrations as like a record of your database, so that Prisma can check it to do like, well, it says here like drift checking, and it can reference the old state of your database, that sort of thing. And I think the issue here is that on cloud providers, there were permissions rules that wouldn't allow Prisma to create that shadow database. So this is now, there's a way around this now, and it is to point a shadow database URL, point to a shadow database URL in your data source. The shadow database then is a separate database on your cloud provider, which can be used to serve the same purpose. So that is how to get around it for cloud providers. I haven't run into this myself because I haven't gone through all of the steps to run migrations in a production environment on a cloud provider. But Niko, have you seen this out in the wild? Has this been something that you've run into?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is going to be really, really helpful since we introduced the preview version of Prisma Migrate. Here I've seen tons of users who ran into that exact problem when they were, for example, following a tutorial that told them how to use a database on Heroku, because it was exactly the same problem that you described, that Prisma Migrate assumes that you have the privilege on the database server to be able to create databases that can then be used as shadow databases by Prisma Migrate. But as soon as that's not the case, and you don't have this these access rights to create new databases on your database server, then it falls flat. And with Heroku, this is exactly how it works, is that you only get a database. You don't get control over the entire server, but only a single database. So this is now super helpful because you can now basically just create two Heroku databases, one connection URL you put into the URL field, the other one into the shadow database URL field, and everything is just going to work as expected. So definitely big benefit for a lot of people, I think.
I guess a trade-off here, maybe not a limitation, but something to be aware of, though, is that you will need to incur the cost of an additional database deployment, if I'm not mistaken, right? If you got one on Heroku for whatever it is, $7 a month, you'll need a separate one for this to work properly. Is that the case?
Right. But I guess that even for the shadow database, you would probably be able to always just use the free plan, I guess, because this is really only used to like run the actual kind of migration. And as far as I know, kind of do like a dry run migration or so. So it's not that you have to store a lot of data in there or that you'll have a lot of connections to that shadow database. So I guess for the shadow database, you could always just use kind of a database from the free plan and not really worry about paying for two databases. At least that's my understanding. I see Tom, one of the persons or like one of the engineers who's working on Migrate, is in the comments. So feel free to correct me here if I'm wrong, Tom.
Cool. But the possibility being open to do this is a big win. Obviously, this is something that would have been a blocker and is now possible to do. I think there's another topic to touch on here in the same vein, and that is about soft resets in cloud-hosted environments, and that's like permissions in those environments to do like a drop database or create database, not there. So there are, that's part of it, like the permissions issues that exist there, and this now being possible through shadow databases. What else should we talk about, Niko? What's another good thing to pick out? Because there's lots here in the release notes, but I don't know if it's worthwhile for us to dive into everything here.
Probably not. I think one thing that we can call out is the Prisma DB that now supports custom schema locations. With quite a few of our CLI commands, or probably almost all of them, you can actually decide on a custom location where your schema.prisma file is located. And by default, the CLI is just going to check a Prisma file, like Prisma folder that contains the schema.prisma file. But if that folder doesn't exist, then the CLI will be confused because it assumes it's there by default. So in order to avoid that confusion, you can just pass the schema option, or even configure the schema option in your package.json under a Prisma key, so that you don't have to provide the schema option every time you run a CLI command. So I guess that's also something that's nice for the folks that have been using Prisma DB Seed already.
Very cool. Prisma DB Seed, of course, is fairly new in itself, so probably more development that's coming there and even more improvements, but that sounds like a really big one. One thing that I will point out is that we've got this breaking changes section, and one to be aware of that might be a potential big deal for some people is the change to the way that float is handled. Float has changed to decimal, from decimal to double in MySQL and Postgres. So I guess what would happen initially is if you had a float, the type that would be created in the database would be like decimal with 6530 here. And this is now different. So in this section here, what does this mean for users? This is the one you'll want to pay attention to. There is, it's changing from float to decimal, and you should pay attention to that because it might change the behavior of your application. The way that your data is stored and the way that it comes out and is rendered might cause some issues for you. So you should check out the notes here to get into the weeds about what is changing. And also, there is a video guide that you can check out. Daniel did a video on the changes to expect here. Have you kind of given this a go, Niko, to see what is different yourself here?
Not really, to be honest. I think that's kind of like a relevant thing for the users who have been using Float in previous versions, and who actually also care about this being mapped to another type. But generally, I think people can just even continue using like decimal if they want to.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the release this week.
Yep.
And if people want to learn more, of course, go ahead and check out the release notes. They are fairly comprehensive this time. Absolutely. With a lot of information. So definitely go ahead and check that out to learn about all the details.
Yep.
But we have a lot more interesting stuff to cover today. So let's move on and bring on our first guest here, and that is Hervé.
Hi.
Hey, Hervé.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Hey, good to see you too.
How are you doing?
Very good. Yeah, I'm very excited to talk a little bit about what we've been up to and what we're looking at doing next. So.
Yeah, perfect. You are the VP of product here at Prisma. That means you're basically the person who decides on how our engineers are going to spend their time and making sure that they are working on the right things, solving the right kind of problems. And one thing, or sorry, if you want to interrupt, yeah.
No, it's a detail, but I don't tell them what to do. Usually, we just show some direction, and they actually know much better how to kind of handle these things and the things we need to build. But yeah, it's a fair description.
Fair enough. And one big component of your work is to also give insight, of course, to our users and our community what we are planning to build next. And the tool that we're using for that is the Prisma roadmap. So today we want to use the opportunity, having you on the stream here, to talk a little bit about the roadmap, how it's structured, the kinds of things that people should be aware of when they're reading the roadmap. So maybe you could go ahead and share your screen so that you can actually show the roadmap and show what we're talking about, and maybe just start with kind of like a high-level overview and explain a little bit how the roadmap is actually structured.
Sure. So you should be able to see my screen. I'm gonna make sure I can see it too. So this is the public roadmap. We're using Notion to update it. And so maybe talking a little bit about the process we're going through when updating the roadmap. So we have a few teams at Prisma, and each team is responsible for a certain area of the product. And what we do when we want to update the roadmap is each team is bringing up topics that they feel strongly about, and usually it's informed by basically every one of you. So everyone in the community surfacing feedback, submitting issues, and voting on issues, and commenting on issues. So that is one big input that we're taking, and that the PMs on the teams and literally everyone in the company can also raise to the attention of these teams. So that's one first thing we're looking at. Second thing we're looking at is the overall vision for Prisma. Like, what do we really want to build? Like, where do we want to be as a product? How do we want to look at? And this is used as a bit of a filter, a lens through which we look at all of these issues. And we have a lot of them to look at, as you may imagine. And then based on what the teams feel like makes sense from a technical perspective, is doable, is feasible, is somewhat well-defined, is interesting and important, then we have a short list that we then look at in a way. And so this is where we really have like the product team looking at that short list and try to imagine how to arrange what should we plan next versus what should we just consider at this point, and try to gather more feedback about. And so this is how we go about planning this.
Okay. So like you mentioned the teams there. What kind of teams do we have at Prisma? How do we structure our work?
So right now we have 4 teams. We have a team focused on migration. So the mission of the team is really taking care of everything happening around making changes to your database schema, introspecting your database to make changes, to incorporate changes made on the database directly into your Prisma schema, but also propagating changes from the Prisma schema onto the database using migrations. Another team we call the client team, who's focused on essentially making sure you can query and make the most out of your database, what's inside your database. So querying information, inserting data, selecting data, connectors as well. Like we're currently working on a new connector as we speak. So that's the second team, and we have a third team that we call developer productivity, who's looking at the integrations like the VS Code plugin, Prisma Studio as well, so the data browser, Nexus as a framework, and also something that we're also currently working on right now, which is a cloud product. I can maybe talk a little bit more about this later. So that's the three first teams, and the fourth team is the support engineering team. They're really helping with the testing infrastructure, ensuring that we have good quality across the board, and that all of the teams have the right tools to execute on implementing these.
All right. And so each team is putting up their own cards on the roadmap and is responsible for kind of maintaining and updating this, making sure that it reflects their current state of planning.
Yeah, so we bring that up into a larger board that is not visible here before it gets to the roadmap, because we, as I said, we have a lot of them. And then we talk it through. There's definitely some level of pre-selection, and it's largely informed, as I said, by GitHub issues. Like, as you can see on the roadmap right now, there's a lot of links to the actual GitHub issues that are related to each of these cards. We're just using Notion because it gives us a little bit more flexibility to expose them, but that's mostly happening in GitHub.
All right. And I see that there are a couple of columns where the cards are currently in. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit what the different kinds of columns mean and what people can expect. For example, if a card is currently in candidates or in planned, like what does this mean maybe in terms of timeline or how committed we are to the feature?
Yes. Yeah, that's very important because there's always the big question of timing. The easiest one first. So recently released is GA features that we recently released that have been made available recently. We end up archiving them over time because we don't want to clutter too much the board. The preview column is what is currently in preview. Preview features are things we are still asking for feedback about, making sure we can stabilize them, and we don't have any sort of edge case that could really turn up to be problematic with the feature. And that is typically something that we keep around for between 6 weeks and sometimes a few months even, depending on how mature the solution is. So for somewhat small features, like, I don't know, order by relations that we released recently, this would typically be around 6 weeks until we don't hear much issues around that feature. Then we kind of promote it to GA. For something like the MySQL server, the Microsoft SQL Server connector, that's a much larger piece of the this is really working fine based on everyone using it. So that's the preview column. WIP is what we're currently working on actively. So that means that the team is currently figuring out the details of the solution and coding these features or solutions. Timelines in software development, you know what they mean, right? Like it's not necessarily predictable. We aim usually at something between 0 to 3 months, roughly, in that column, before it starts hitting preview or GA directly, depending on the feature. The larger the feature, the more we're going to get through early access than preview before it hits GA. So that would be the case for MongoDB, as an example. And the smaller the features, sometimes we just go through directly into GA when they're non-controversial. So that's the first, this column, work in progress. And planned is something that we're committing to be doing. We want to get to it, and we're really looking at doing that. And the typical timelines, I'm saying typical with like a big emphasis on that word, is between 3 to 6 months usually. That being said, it can vary. We had some things planned that kind of landed much earlier than that, and we also had some things in plan that landed a little bit later than that. But it just gives a bit of a rough idea of where to expect something, because we also know that some people need to know so that they can figure if they have to wait, or they can wait, or if they need to figure out an alternative solution in the meantime. And lastly, candidates are things we are leaning on. We are heavily expecting to work on, we would like to work on, but they're mostly considerations, and this is where we either don't know enough about the scope and the size of doing anything about the specific feature, or it's just something that we may bring in or may drop depending on how the rest of what we're doing is impacting our work. So we had some things in there that we ended up dropping, some others that got pushed into plan. And so this is mostly a discussion we have that's also influenced by the feedback we receive from the community and users. And this is how we go about that specific column. So it's more there to give you a direction and the things that we're considering, so you understand what our direction is. It's not necessarily something I would use as a clear commitment.
Got it. Okay, and just to recap also, I think all of this info is also available on the roadmap itself. There is a link like right above the board that says details on how we update the roadmap. And on there, you can also read up a little bit on the structure and the stuff that Hervé just explained.
Exactly.
Maybe to wrap things up here, how can people get involved if they want to see something on the roadmap that is not currently on there yet? What is the thing that people can do in order to get this on the roadmap?
It's talk to us. I think it's the easiest thing to do. We do listen to feedback and really are eager to meet directly with people. I think GitHub is great to discuss briefly, get some comments in. But it's sometimes hard to really get the full context of what people are trying to achieve. And this is really what feeds product managers. Like we really need to understand the full context so that we make better decisions, and we bring that context in the teams, so that when the engineering teams are building something, they do that with that context in mind, and so they make good decisions naturally. We're really eager on that. Then to really push some priorities up, it's really a matter of understanding how much and how many people are really wanting something, because obviously we're trying to serve as many as we can, and trying to avoid getting into just individual features that really serve just a very small portion of the community. And that means like hard decisions sometimes, like some things that do make sense indeed, but really represent either too much work or just represent just a handful of use cases that are more or less on the edge. So publishing issues in GitHub is really a good way to get a request in. There's a lot of them already, so there's also chances that searching for one is a good idea. And upvoting them, we do look at issues sorted down by voting, so we just have them surfacing up in an easier way. And then discuss them in the community. Slack, for example, is another good way to get our attention. We have a dedicated channel on the public Slack called Product Feedback. So if you have feedback on the product, or if you want to hear more about why something is not prioritized, or if there's any status update we could give, then feel free to chime in, and we'll do our best. So that would be the ways. And yeah, the discussing is the easiest. Again, I think it's really how we, by fully grasping what people are trying to achieve, we really get a much better idea of what we can do.
That's great. Maybe as a last question, like what are the things that are you personally kind of most excited about on the roadmap? What do you think will be the most impactful for our users?
Oh, that's a $1 million question. I'm excited about a lot of things on that. I mean, right now the MongoDB support is quite exciting because it's a first step into document storage, and how to really figure out how a Prisma schema brings value to MongoDB users. We do really strongly believe that having a strongly typed schema can help people developing with document stores, and so they can really benefit from the document store capabilities while also getting all the value from like the nice developer experience that the Prisma client offers. So I'm pretty excited about this one for sure. The hosted data browser is also another one that is interesting. Is going to be a first step in the cloud. So we're looking at introducing a cloud product very soon with like a first and early access that we will reserve to excited people who really want to give a try and provide us with feedback. And it's going to be focused on just giving access to a hosted data browser that looks like pretty much what Studio is right now, inviting people and giving them access and controlling access to this Studio instance. So it really makes it super easy to collaborate on a database together in a team or in a company. So these two would be really getting my attention. Obviously, Prisma Migrate becoming GA, it's been there for a while. It's one of the last but not least sort of mention I would grab. We've been working really hard on that to really get to something that I believe has some unique capabilities that can really help teams to become more proficient in changing the schemas and bringing that confidence, I guess.
I've got a question, Hervé, on our delving into document databases. Christoph in the chat is really wanting to see DynamoDB, and so am I. This is something that I've been getting into lately. Is it number 2 after Mongo? Any thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on Dynamo? Because it's a different paradigm. It's quite a different paradigm than a lot of other even document databases.
Yeah, it is super interesting. I think Dynamo is for sure something we will look into. I don't know when, to be clear. I think we chose Mongo out of like the high volume of requests we just got. Like on Mongo, it's just it's the most highly rated feature on the entire GitHub of Prisma at the moment. So this is definitely a strong argument in favor of supporting Mongo first. I think it's about like bringing the paradigm, and then we'll see how that can apply to other ones. I think Dynamo is for sure one of the key players in that space too, and that's something I'm also eager to understand how much and how far we can support. It's not visible at this point. I think we have a ton more things that are not visible on the candidates list, but that would definitely be one of the ones I would look at too.
That's awesome. So Christoph, find an open issue if there is one on our GitHub, and get all your friends to upvote it and make a lot of noise. And maybe Hervé will place it into the roadmap here.
And get in touch with us. We're happy to talk about what you want to do with Dynamo.
Absolutely.
All right, Hervé, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see each other on Slack in the next couple of days. Thank you, Hervé.
It's my pleasure. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, that was a nice overview of the roadmap. And now it's time to bring on our next guest, and that is Jed Watson from KeystoneJS. Hey, Jed, nice to meet you. All right, first of all, I want to express my appreciation, Jed. You are based in Australia, which means right now it is 3:30 a.m. for you. Is that right?
3:32. But yeah, it's real dark outside.
All right.
No, it's really cool to be here. Thank you for having me. I don't mind a nice excuse to stay up late coding, so this is definitely scratch that itch for me.
That's awesome. Yeah, we have actually been talking internally quite a bit about Keystone lately. And one thing that triggered this was the course that Wes Boss has released. So for the folks in the audience who are watching right now and you don't know who Wes Boss is, he's probably one of the most prominent JavaScript teachers out there with a ton of really, really great courses. And one of his courses is called Advanced React, I think. That's a full stack course on building a React application, including a GraphQL backend. And the initial version of that course was based on Prisma 1. And now for the second version of the course, he chose to use Keystone. And we'll talk a little bit about the decision process there as well with Jed. But maybe to kick things off, Jed, you could quickly introduce yourself and also give a short pitch for what Keystone actually is.
Yeah, great. So hi everyone, I'm Jed. I co-founded a company here in Sydney about 7 years ago called ThinkMill. We're a development consultancy. We come from a long line of devs who've been working together building things like content management systems and a whole set of complex apps for the internet for more years than the gray hair gives me away, more years than I care to admit online. And when we started ThinkMill, I got really into open source and also adopted Node sort of shortly before that. And we looked around the landscape and there were all these great bits and pieces that you could put together. It was very hackable, but there were no frameworks. There was no sort of larger building blocks to build out of. And so we originally created Keystone to sort of scratch our own itch. And we've been doing it for nearly 7 years ever since. So it's been one of the big content management systems for Node.js. It's gone through a couple of pivots. The most recent one was about 2 years ago when we made the full transition to headless GraphQL API and a content management UI that we generate from a schema. And probably the most exciting recent thing that's happened is there's a big new version coming out, which I'm going to preview today. This is my first demo on the internet of some of the stuff we've been up to. It's the same version that Wes is using for his course. And one of the big news items, of course, is that we've also built it on Prisma. And it's been a very cool journey. A couple of things that you were talking about before, like the MongoDB driver, we've also been watching that coming through the pipeline because Keystone was originally started on Mongoose and MongoDB. More than any other reason, because that was the main driver available for node.js at the time. It was very hard to get anything else that would actually help you talk to a database with some schema logic. It was sort of one of the first mature ORM type pieces of functionality in the ecosystem. And it's been really hard to move off that. I'm so excited to have Prisma kind of coming into that space and being such a robust tool. So having like that come full circle to MongoDB will be really fun. But also you talked about like proving out the value of schema with document stores. And that's actually something that Keystone's been doing for years. So that's been a really familiar topic where we overlay all this business logic on top of a document database. So we should nerd out about that some of the time.
All right.
But yeah, it's that was a very rambling intro, but that's sort of how we got to where we are today.
Perfect. One quick question I have, because you do categorize Keystone as a CMS, and I think the like kind of image that a lot of people have in their heads when they think about CMSs is more maybe a system like Contentful or Graph CMS, like sort of a tool where you kind of configure your data structures through a web editor maybe, and then it spits out an API that developers can talk to, and at the same time maybe a UI for content creators. So how does Keystone fit into that model if it's more a code-based CMS actually?
Yeah, great question. I think we actually struggled for a long time calling it a CMS because we've used it as a backend to build like incredible rich apps on. We've got a project we've run in for a company in San Francisco who are in medical AI. And we built out their backend data pipeline system on KeystoneJS. It's not really a CMS when you use its full power, and that's because our first audience is developers. It's open source, and we care more than anything else about the developer experience of using it. And a lot of the other CMSs, including the ones you mentioned, they are these online platforms. They're really great for getting started with. You can sort of click some buttons and get an API on the internet. But when you get to month 3 or month 6 or month 9 or year 5 on a project, you've gotten to this point where you've got all this rich functionality, and it's very hard to sort of cram that into what is effectively a walled garden. If you can't write some code and have it run, then there's only so much control you can take over the back end of your application. So what we're trying to build is a platform that sits on top of something like Prisma, which is this great low-level data access API, overlays a whole stack of business rules on top, and gives you a really nice sort of out-of-the-box content management experience. And the idea is that you can just extend both of those as different requirements mature.
Got it.
Yeah.
So if we think about this as like sort of a spectrum where we have kind of web frameworks like Express and maybe Nest.js on the other side, and then these fully closed platforms like Graph CMS and Contentful, then it sounds like with Keystone, you're somewhere in the middle of that kind of spectrum, where you're able to get things done fast, but you're also able to drop down to code when you need the flexibility and control for some really custom requirements that these closed platforms don't allow you to implement.
Yeah, that's the idea. So like if you had something like Prisma sort of at that bottom level of your stack for the database access, and something like Next.js at the top, some of the features you were talking about, like how, flexibility is key. And I think that's a shared philosophy between what we're doing with Keystone and what you're doing with Prisma. It's also very much part of Next's philosophy. From what I can tell, they've sort of got this out-of-the-box experience that's modeled on PHP, like just write some pages, put them on a website. You've got put them on a server, you've got a website, right? But then you can start writing React and SPAs and like get all this rich functionality in there kind of as and when you need it. So if you had that stack of like something like Next and Prisma and Keystone in the middle, I think for us, that's one of the ideal web stacks these days.
Got it. What do you think sets Keystone apart from kind of its main competitors? And what would even be the main competitors that are on a kind of a similar level of that spectrum, I guess? I think maybe Strapi is kind of a similar tool that falls into a different category.
I think
into a similar.
Strapi in Nodeland is probably one of the closest sort of. It's the other major headless CMS written in Node, and that's open source. There's a couple of other new ones. Directus, there's another one that launched recently. I think the difference between something like Strapi and something like Keystone is Strapi really started with this bootstrapping experience, and it reminds me a bit of Rails. Like it's kind of this half config, half convention thing. What we've done with Keystone is quite a different approach. It's really just idiomatic JavaScript. It's designed to feel like code you would write yourself, except you didn't have to write all that code yourself. And that's sort of, I think, compared to the other open source CMSs, it's really that its architecture and its flexibility is its strength. Like it's a lot more powerful in what you can do. And then compared to the closed source competitors, which are all very polished and nice and incredibly expensive on a monthly basis, they sort of box you in because they have to, because you're using code that they wrote that they're running for you. And so there's huge limitations that come with that. And we're really trying to get the best of both worlds with Keystone. All
right. So now you've made me really curious to actually see what Keystone looks like. And I think you've prepared a little bit of a demo. So I would love to see that now. And if you want, you can go ahead and share your screen. We'll put it up here on the screen. And then I'm excited to learn more.
Great. Let me just, I think... Let's see, did that work?
Yes.
Have you got my screen?
Yes,
excellent.
There it is.
Cool. Let me just throw this over here so I can still see you all. Yeah, so look, it's always hard to know where to start, but why not with the code? I said the focus is devs. This is your entry file. When you create a Keystone project, you have a keystone.ts in this case. And this is really simple. This is just mostly just config. We could almost express this in something like YAML. Where do I'm using the Prisma adapter and I'm connecting to this Postgres database here. And I'm plugging in, the most important part here is my list schema. So let's jump in and have a quick look at that. This is like a sort of an extrapolated Prisma schema, if you will. It's very similar. It's written in TypeScript, but we can annotate it with a lot more functionality. But as you can see, I've got a user list here. I might just make that bigger for the stream. A user list here. I've got some access control permissions that I've put on it, really basic stuff. And here are my fields: name, email, password. And then I've got a post list, which has title, status, some content, and a relationship back to users for authors. So just at this point, having written these files, that's really all I need to do to then start a dev server and get this admin UI. So for front end, we can come in and see, this is a fresh database of about an hour ago. That's me there. And then jump into posts, and I've written a Hello Prisma post. And this is a quick, that's a dead giveaway.
All right. So that's like the admin UI that also like content creators and content managers would basically use here?
Absolutely. So if you were to buy Contentful, you would have used a visual editor to set up the schema that I've written in code here. And they would have given you a admin UI, very like different color scheme, of course, but it's fundamentally very similar to this. And that's kind of half the story. The other half is then what happens in the back end. So just to dive into what we're generating to make this work, there is a Next.js app, which is this admin UI, and there is a Prisma schema, which looks like this. We need to update to the version that actually now ships native types because I'm getting a warning. But there's my Prisma model, users and posts. You can sort of see that one-to-one reflection of the schema I've defined here and the way we've been able to strip out the irrelevant sort of UI and access control related pieces and generate a Prisma schema and access the database through the Prisma client. So that's kind of how the back end of this works. What you couldn't do easily with Contentful is get this, this part of the UI and just come in and specify another option to point this at a React component.
Ooh.
Right. I didn't actually prepare that one earlier, so I'm not going to refresh, but that would give you your own React component coming out of this file as this part of the UI here. And that's really, really nice. Another thing that we can do is do things like interpolate what we call virtual fields. And this is just a little snippet of a GraphQL resolver here. So I'm saying I'm adding a float into the GraphQL schema, and the resolver for that is going to return my random number function. We do, alongside the Prisma schema, generate some helpful types and, of course, the GraphQL schema. So the difference between the Prisma schema and the GraphQL schema is going to be things like my random number float that is coming out, which then if I jump over to my users and come in here, that was 4. And if I refresh this screen, we're going to keep seeing a different random number coming out. And that's like, a random number is the simplest line of code you could write, but you could integrate this with an entire backend system. In fact, if you were using Nexus to write a whole lot of custom queries and mutations on top of your Prisma client, Nexus is going to generate an executable GraphQL schema. And that's the next thing I'm going to show you, which is we can actually take an executable schema in, mutate it, and give one back again. So I'm extending it here with some custom things like a random number query and a mutation that's going to create a random number of posts. But you could also take the GraphQL schema that Nexus generates and graph that onto your Keystone schema. And that is really a lot of flexibility, and it sort of puts Keystone at the middle of that ecosystem really nicely, where you can stitch together a bunch of different services, either that you've written yourself or that you've integrated with on the internet. And then you can, I mean, I'm not going to show you here because we will absolutely run out of time, but you can then start adding things like your own custom pages into the admin UI using the design system components we've produced to build your own custom workflows kind of around these CRUD workflows that we've given you. So you replace the parts that you need to replace, and you get to keep the things for free that you didn't need to customize as the project matures.
All right. So to like recap a little bit about the workflow, you've mentioned it, but it effectively starts all again with the schema. And in Keystone, the way how I would define a schema is just using code. I would use JavaScript or TypeScript in order to define my data structures. And then you're using kind of Prisma under the hood to map these data structures to the database. And at the same time, what you also do, and we haven't talked about this in particular yet, but you generate this GraphQL API that people can then use to interact with the database, right? And the second component next to that GraphQL API that you get is this admin UI that you just showed that is also easily customizable with custom React component. If you don't kind of like the default layout, or if you have special requirements, you want to use your own design system, it's also very easy to customize this admin UI.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of this is par for the course, the admin UI and the GraphQL API and having a database behind the scenes, where we've really tried to go into helping people write, like content-driven websites on one hand, but also apps, because in our experience, the line between those two gets really blurry, right? So let me just show you something from the content management side. I've been really looking forward to demoing this because I had a look at your website earlier, and I was trying to think of what I could demo the CMS features with. And there's this really cool new field that we've written, which is a rich document editor. And when I say rich document, I mean it's not a WYSIWYG editor. It's one of the new gen block editors. And so I found these things, and I thought, if I was a content editor trying to edit the Prisma homepage, what would I want? So let's just create a I shouldn't put that in a slug. I'll just go with this for now. So this is our content editor here. It's got the sort of stuff that you'd expect. And got some layouts, which is nice. And where things get super interesting is this little button over here where I'm going to drop in a quote. What you can see here is I've actually got 2 different areas that I'm typing into. I'm sure if you've used things like Confluence Cloud, you've seen things like this before, where I could drop in, an info block, maybe pick the different type of info block that I'm going to do. Our vision here is to actually create the first content management system for the design system generation, because design systems and modern front ends all work in components. What components need is structured data. And with most CMSs, you sort of get structured data at the tags or published data authors level, but then you just end up in this HTML block. So what we've created here is the ability to define custom blocks. And if I wanted to drop this content in from Prisma, let's just add a thing about the Prisma Studio. I'll just drop this content in. I don't know why that's not pasting. So we're actually seeing sort of a visual representation of what we're creating. Now,
super sweet.
Yeah, this is a more advanced version of a component, whereas these quote and content blocks are really simple ones. So if I want to add these calls to action and maybe this image, I'll grab that image's address. If I come in and edit this and paste that image in, now I've got the preview image on the left. And then if I say, I want to have some call to actions on this, I need one that says, where does that go to? I'll copy the link, paste that in. All right, so that's going to say download. The command is npx Prisma Studio.
Wow.
So that's sort of what we mean when we say a content management system for design systems.
That's really cool.
Now if I pull that data out, let me just get the content. This is all coming out of structured data. There's our, where is it? There's our content block. Down here, there's the image source and the hyperlink of the call to action. This is all structured data that I can map to React components on the front end. And to put that together,
in the editor, how does it know about the styles that you're wanting to use? Like, especially in the call to action button, they look just like the. Did you pre-configure that?
I absolutely did. I went and I inspected these and I borrowed your colors. I set all of this up. Full disclaimer, I had a complete technical failure just before the meetup, and I set all of this up while you were doing the first half-hour intros. That's why my CSS is a little bit off. But what's going on here is I've pointed the document field, like I showed you before, at a custom React component here. And now here's my product component. It's got 2 parts to it. I've defined the props for it, which is very similar to the way we define schema. only this is actually going to a JSON block behind the scenes. We'll store that in a JSON column in your Postgres database. We've got child nodes and text nodes and checkboxes and selects and all sorts of things you can drop in there. And then these are the components that I dropped in. Like, it looks like a lot of code because all my CSS is in JS and inlined here, but there's the thing that looks like a button, and there's it displaying the call to action value. And it's only showing these buttons if that discriminant field we created is true.
Cool.
So these are super trivial to create. That's literally all there is. You do this, and we turn that into an editable component in this UI.
That's awesome. Yeah, and this is something that like you wouldn't see. I wouldn't know how to do this in Contentful, for example. Like you wouldn't be able to configure to this level.
Absolutely can't do this in Contentful or Graph CMS or Sanity or Strappy. As far as I'm aware, this is actually world first, and you guys are getting the first demo of it.
Amazing. This is really cool.
So cool. I have two more questions for you, Jed. So I think, actually, you can like keep your screen there just in case we want to show maybe the website or so later. But we talked about this quickly already before, that you were in contact with Wes Boss about his course, and I was wondering what for him in the end was the decisive factor why he picked Keystone over another tool for his course.
Yeah, great question, because he looked at a few of them. He did a big assessment of all of the things he could build on. And I was talking to him at the time. And well, actually, after he made the decision, we worked really closely with him because he looked at the current version of Keystone. And what I've just shown you is so new that it's not even mentioned on our website yet. We actually have next.keystonejs.com, which still has a lot of content to be added to it. But this is where we started documenting this new version and taking some inspiration from Prisma. We've published our roadmap. But what it got down to was the flexibility and the access control permissions. So we've actually built with him the complete backend for his sort of the final stage in his course in this e-commerce example in our Keystone project code base. So in his schema, he has a lot of custom logic for things like the label, which formats parts of it, and the virtual fields were a real strength, as well as the flexibility of being able to say, users can create orders if they're signed in, they can read them if they can order, and they can't update them or delete them. So order items follow a similar one. There's this can manage order rule. And then you've got things like products that only managers can actually edit. So the ability to express these permissions as functions was a really key thing. This is what that access file looks like. And you just take the session and determine whether something is true or false here. So it was the expressiveness, the fact that it's kind of just JavaScript, that you'd be writing yourself to implement this, that's mapped into such like a sophisticated kind of thing that gives you all the rest of the stuff that you want, that I think really, from the course's perspective, he was looking for something that would let him teach the students advanced React and GraphQL. So you want to teach them how to build this logic, but you don't want to have 5,000 lines of your GraphQL API implementation. And I think this really hit the right middle ground of those two things. A lot of this, as you can see here, there are some additional, where is the rest of that schema? Mutations. He's got mutations for like adding things to cart. And this is somewhere that you can actually, one of the things we give you in context is the Prisma client. So you can operate on Keystone's high level APIs where you can drop down to Prisma, or you can use Prisma to drop down to like executing queries directly against the database. You've got this really neat channel that you can just kind of punch through the layers, but only when you need to. checking out with Stripe integration, all these validation rules, sending email messages for invoices, all that sort of stuff is something that this is what he wanted to teach his students how to do. But Keystone removes all of the boilerplate that would otherwise sit around it.
Very, very nice. All right. Yeah, then maybe to wrap things up, what's next for Keystone? I mean, obviously, there's next.KeystoneJS.com, I think, is the website that you just showed. It's kind of the next version. So that's what you're all kind of working on at the moment and trying to push out next, I guess.
Yeah, so ThinkMill, we've got about a team of between 40 and 50. Mainly software developers and designers. And there's a team of 5 of us who, as of late last year, are working full-time on Keystone. So it's been around for a long time, but we've never had such a dedicated team committed to building it out as like an open source product. So we're sort of early embarking on that particular journey, despite it being a fairly mature platform. So this is our kind of big vision for what this next version of it's going to be able to do. The document editor is new. The App UI is rewritten. We've kind of simplified all these APIs. And now we have about a year's worth of roadmap for various features and enhancements that we're planning to put on top of this. So it's going to be my first time getting out of my day job being consulting and this being a bit of a side project to just like building out a product full-time this year. I'm very excited about it.
That's super cool. And the product is a developer tool, which I think are the best products to be working on as a developer anyways. Because you can scratch your own itches, basically.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We've lived and breathed why we need this and why the other platforms out there just aren't things that we could have, like, we keep looking at this going, do we still need to keep building this? Like, can't we just use something else? And the answer always comes back as no.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right. There was one question from Nassar asking whether the admin UI is customizable. And I think the answer is yes. We quickly talked about this. We didn't show it on the stream, but this is absolutely possible. You can just point the form elements to your custom React components, and then things will be rendered in a custom way. So this is definitely possible, if I understood correctly what you said before, Jed.
Absolutely. There's a lot here that, because this is quite new. Just if anyone actually goes to KeystoneJS.com, I should probably mention this. We're going to add a banner here tomorrow pointing people at this next version. That's how new the stuff I'm showing you is. But you can do things like replace, this React component or this React component, or you can replace the navigation component, and you can even add your own pages in, which we basically just hoist into that Next.js app that we're generating for you. So the idea is that at the end of the day, we generate a Prisma schema, but if at some point what you want to do is manage your own Prisma schema and just have a compatible Keystone schema, then we plan to make that possible, and we'll just validate it to make sure, like, very much the same approach Prisma's taken to databases, I guess, in that if you want it to reflect your database, that's an option. Whereas if you want it to migrate your database to match your Prisma schema, that's also an option. That's kind of the sort of plan we have going forward for things like customizing the admin UI and managing the Prisma schema. Bite off as much as you want to chew. But if there's particular things you can't customize yet, if you pick it up and have a play with it and start using it, there's a theme behind the scenes we haven't exposed an API for, but let us know what you're interested in, because this is sort of, that's really good feedback to help us, know what we're building next.
All right, Jed, thank you so much for this overview. That was fantastic. I learned a lot about Keystone. Ryan, do you have any other questions, or should we let Jed go?
I think we should let him go to bed. Thank you, Jed, for joining us so late. And Keystone looks awesome. I am excited to check it out myself. It is, I can see the capabilities that it has being super useful. So people out there in the chat, check out Keystone as well. And thanks for showing us.
Thank you, Jed. See you.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to talk to you all.
Cheers.
See you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, that leaves the two of us, Ryan.
Just the two of us. I think we're done. I think that's wrapping up, isn't it?
Yep, definitely. I don't think we have anything else to talk about today. So thanks everybody for tuning in again this week. And we'll see you here in 2 weeks again with hopefully big news by then. Won't say a lot more what I mean, but if everything goes well, in 2 weeks, we'll have a bit of a special episode again. So looking forward to see everybody then.
Me too. Take care, everyone.
Cheers, Ryan.